In this video, I'm going to discuss using HTML5 input types and attributes. Now, I've got a contact form here, and it's a big screen. It's wide. It's a desktop or a laptop, so it's easy to actually lay this out. But when it gets smaller, we're going to have some issues. Now, typically, you would have a form element here, like an input field, and then you'd have a label for it. So I've got the labels right now currently on top of the actual input fields. What I want to do, though, is when I make the screen smaller, when this form is loaded on a mobile device like a tablet or a smartphone, we want to be able to make it responsive and do some things with it. Let's go ahead and take a look at the code. And here in the CSS at the top of the page, I've got my input text area, input name, input tell, input email, input message. So that's the very first thing I want to talk about. If I go down to our form, you can see right here that we have a label that's encasing the form element. I've got a span, and I've given it a class name of label. And then here's the actual label that we're seeing in that large screen format, the text that's going to be right on top of the input element. Now here I've got the input type, and you can see that it's text here, but here I've got telephone, email, and message. And that's something about HTML5 that you want to pay attention to, is whenever possible, make sure that you use these new input types, because they're really useful when you're parsing data and for all sorts of different purposes. And that's why if I go back up to my code here, that's why I've got input, name, telephone, email, and message. So this is going to affect everything in those elements. Right now, all I'm doing is just setting a width and a margin on that. Now, I've also got text area message, and what I've done is I've used box sizing border box. Now, what this does is it renders elements in a page, such as input elements, with the dimensions on the inside rather than the outside. If you've ever set up a form object or a div container and set padding, you'll notice that it messes up everything around it, because the padding is actually considered or added to the dimensions of that item. If you use border box, which I'm using here, border dash box, that'll make sure that the form elements, the input elements, actually have the padding dimensions inside rather than outside. So it's just a safe thing to do, and it's another new feature of HTML5. But here's where things really start working. So if I go down to our maximum width, so this is any screen size larger than 1024 pixels, you can see here that I've got these CSS rules right here. Now, what these are placeholder, WebKit input placeholder, so that's for Chrome and Safari browsers. We have Mozilla placeholder for Firefox, one for Internet Explorer, and then we're also using this one as well, just to capture earlier Mozilla browsers. Now, what I've done here for these placeholders is to turn them off, but rather than use display none, which you would typically do, I've done color and set it to white. And the reason I've done that is because if I turn them off, it would actually turn off the actual input elements, so we wouldn't see the inputs for name, telephone, and so on. So let's go back down to the code, and you see here's the placeholder right here. So the placeholder is a new feature in HTML5. It'll actually put helper text, a placeholder, inside your input element. So it'll put name, telephone, email address, and that'll just prompt the user that this is what this particular field is for. And that's really useful in responsive design, because remember, the screen gets smaller, and on a large screen view, I've got the helper right there. But when we get smaller, what I want to do is have the placeholder appear. So I've just turned it off by making it white on a large screen. So what I've done here is set up some spans, and those spans each have a class called label. So if I go up to our CSS, you can see here that on the large screen view, that label span is given some values. I'm basically turning it on here by saying give it a color and then display it using block. But if we go to the smaller screens, label span turns off. So what I've done here is essentially turn off that label that we set up in a span and turning it off in the lower screen sizes. And that's when the actual placeholder will take over. So here's what it looks like. As the screen size changes, as the viewport changes to a smaller size, you can see now that we've actually got the placeholders inside the input elements, and the labels have disappeared. And this is what we want. So if I go ahead and click here, you'll see that the placeholder disappears, and I can go ahead and start typing my name, same with telephone, email, and so on. So that's a really useful method in responsive web design. So it just makes your forms more readable and easier to fit on the screen for your users, and that's an important part of responsive web design.